there's a lot of fires for the IRFU to fight at the moment. Some of them completely out of their control, some of them in their control. Since you were last with us, civil war has broken out within Irish rugby on the women's side of the game. The quick refresher is that 62 current and former players sent a letter to the government outlining their issues with the IRFU, the substandard commitment from the union to the women's game, describing it as inequitable, untrustworthy, described the current plans for the game as being in disarray, says that the running of the game has been a significant failure. The IRFU responded very quickly, saying and refuting the overall tenor of the document, saying it was disappointing with the timing of the letter. The government came out and said they were disappointed with the IRFU's initial response, and then a major climb down from the IRFU saying that they would publish in full the 2 independent reviews that are currently being undertaken into women's rugby. They wanted to assure all those devoted to rugby, including the players who issued the letter to government ministers, that the situation that developed, particularly in the last week, is regrettable, and we will work tirelessly to mend and build a relationship between the union and our players. And then the Minister for Sport, Jack Chambers, was on News Talk yesterday with Pat Kenny, saying he had met with the players and the IRFU, thanked them for their leadership and the courage they've shown, said he was optimistic that the relationship could be mended, outlined their concerns, said they had 3 core asks. They're seeking the publication of the reviews, which is now going to happen, looking for better engagement and dialogue with the IRFU, to go to meet each other in the new year to begin that process. And they're also looking for oversight and implementation of issues in women's rugby. And Sport Ireland are going to engage in that process, that it's now all about building trust and enhancing support. I don't think we're quite at the stage where it's going to be Bing Crosby and David Bowie emerging from IRFU offices singing Peace on Earth. But there has been a little bit of progress, because it did feel as though they had gone to the edge of the cliff and pretty much gone over and there was no way back. But I guess there has to be a way back.
Yeah, of course there has to be a way back. First of all, when the letter was sent into government, it was an incredibly bold move from current and ex-players. But I think it spoke of their exasperated nature of where their voice had fallen on deaf ears for a number of years, where they didn't take advantage of the positives 10 years ago with beating the All Blacks in a World Cup, by winning the Grand Slam, and nothing, the foundations ultimately that the development of the game was not properly put in place. And I think maybe lip service was paid to an awful lot of what was said, and and yet nothing was ultimately done. And it took this shock reaction, which also was met with an incredibly kind of foolish reaction from the IRFU. And I think the fact that they rode back on it, they realized that their error of how there's very little sympathy from their side of things. If the women are going to go and publicly step past them and voice their concerns, you can't come back and have another bite and try and put them down and kind of take away from what ultimately they're saying. So
and they had to be shamed into that climb down. Like, while they deserve credit for releasing the 2 reports, as you say, this was an incredibly strong tactic that the players and former players had to take. They ultimately had to publicly shame the IRFU into doing this.
Yeah, they did. And I was, when the letter was released and it was made public, I was obviously texting a couple of different pals within rugby around it. And that's always been a contentious issue with the IRFU, and is these reports, is the findings, and ultimately the information that is leaked out. Now I understand as well, if you send out the whole report at times, it can be damning to individuals as well with the level of honesty that they might have given. But yet, ultimately, unless you get these reports made public to understand what the failings are in particular, it's fine when reports are made public when things have gone well, but when they've struggled, and I suppose you could look back to 2007 with France. I'm sure many of us wouldn't have wanted that to have gone public, but yet you don't fully know what's contained in them as individuals, and when you're not getting the answers that you're looking for, and when there's no ultimate change thereafter, and which has definitely been the case with the women's team over the last number of years, their concern was that they weren't going to actually get the level of answers and detail that they felt that they as individuals had given to where the union had fallen down, and it was going to be a watered down version of what they said, and they weren't willing to stand by that. And I can understand 100% from that perspective. So I think it's a positive that these reports are going to be made public, that we're going to understand exactly what the failings were, and then learn from them and move on from them. And it does feel in some quarters that I'm not saying that there was an arrogance from the union, but it did feel as though, by their reaction, that the women's some of the women's concerns was a bit of an afterthought, and I think this has grabbed their attention and this has turned things around. When sometimes when you go over someone's head, you could look back and you could think, gosh, from a women's perspective, you've got to be careful of the hand that feeds you, but ultimately the union hasn't been feeding them. So that's how frustrated they felt that even their future employer, even someone that's going to help them change the game, they're not listening, and so we have to step beyond their position, the CEO, and go to government. So I think ultimately we'll get to where we need to go. It's just it had to happen through embarrassing the union.
And too late, because there's as you say, the momentum that was there 2013, 14, 15 has been lost. And I know you were very involved around the 20 by 20 movement last year. And I do remember being at quite a few of the talks towards the end as to what happens next. And there was a huge pressure put on media, rightly, to improve their coverage of women's sport and commercial partners to get involved. But the sense was it would all come down to the national and governing bodies to go and implement. And when you think where rugby was in 2015, it was probably well ahead of all the other major sports when it came to the women's game. And the fact that it didn't embrace and enhance and back the game then is just so damning for everybody involved. And it does feel that at the end of this process, whenever that comes early in the new year, that they are starting from a pretty low ebb, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the big issue with the union is I think they misread the room. I think they don't realize that 30% of people that attend games in the Aviva Stadium are female. They're not all participants. They're mothers, daughters, just sport lovers. And so they're watching the men, but they'll absolutely go and equally watch the women if those games are available for them to attend. So it's not just a case of those 62 voices being disgruntled and put out. There's a way bigger body of people that are not going to accept a lack of equality and a lack of energy and effort put into one sex sport versus the other. And so enough is enough. And I think finally the union has realized that it's way bigger than maybe they perceived it to be initially.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be covering this a lot during 2022.